Thank you for listening to the Urban Odyssey podcast. If you enjoy the content we release, please consider supporting us by subscribing to our Substack. A monthly membership is only $5 per month, and if you decide to buy a year-long membership, it's only $50 for the entire year. Purchase a membership now at the official urban.substack.com. Again, that is the official urban.substack.com. Now back to the audio.
Imagine stumbling upon a forgotten library hidden for centuries, and its contents could radically shift our understanding of early Christianity, maybe even the very nature of reality.
It sounds like fiction, doesn't it? But that kind of discovery, the kind that really does rewrite history.
Well, it happened December 1945, Upper Egypt.
Precisely. It wasn't just a story. It was this profound archaeological find, texts that spoke volumes about a spiritual movement almost entirely erased from memory.
And that's what we're diving into today, the fascinating world of Gnosticism.
We're drawing heavily on Manly P. Hall's incredible work, The Wisdom of the Knowing Ones, Gnosticism, the Key to Esoteric Christianity.
And this isn't just some dusty ancient belief system. Hall presents it as a profound philosophy, something that really challenged the prevailing views of its time.
And, as we'll hopefully uncover, it offers some startling insights into human consciousness, the universe, things that still resonate today.
Absolutely. Our source material here, it's rich. You've got historical context, deep philosophical debates, very symbolic language.
Right. So our mission for you listening is to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from these ancient teachings.
We want to understand, why were they so controversial? And maybe more importantly, discover their surprising relevance. Relevance to our own modern quest for understanding.
We'll be exploring the Gnostic worldview, their really unique concept of God, which can be quite subtle. Their perspective on the human predicament, and crucially, how they believed true salvation or liberation could actually be found.
It's really a journey into knowing, isn't it? An exploration of Gnosis itself.
Exactly.
So let's begin with that dramatic rediscovery, the resurrection of Gnosis, we could call it. It all starts, rather mundanely, in a field in Egypt.
It does. The pivotal moment was December 1945. An Egyptian countryman, Muhammad Ali Salman, I believe his name was.
Right.
He made this truly momentous archaeological discovery near Nag Hammadi. This area was close to Chenabaskin, one of the earliest, largest Christian monastic communities.
And what he found wasn't just a few fragments, it was significant.
Oh, absolutely. A large, red earthenware jar. And inside, 13 letter-bound papyrus books. Codices, really.
And the sources mention this legend, almost mystical, that when the jar was broken, a cloud of golden dust rose up and vanished.
Yes, like long-suppressed knowledge finally finding its way back into the light. A symbolic moment, perhaps.
And the timing is just remarkable, isn't it? This Nag Hammadi discovery.
Right, followed less than a year later by the unearthing of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Khirbet Qumran.
Two massive finds, back to back.
And scholars quickly saw a connection, a deep one. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal these early Christian Gnostic teachings.
While the Dead Sea Scrolls, they contain writings from heterodox Jewish mystics, Essenes, possibly.
Exactly, and this suggested something really powerful. Maybe a hidden, secret tradition of esoteric religiosity woven right into Semitic spiritual history. Something bridging both Jewish and early Christian thought.
Which then raises the big question, why was Gnosticism so obscure for so long? 1,500 years.
A millennium and a half, yeah. And for most of that time, almost everything we knew about Gnostics came exclusively from their enemies.
The heresiologists.
Church fathers like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, their whole aim was to attack, ridicule, distort Gnostic teachings.
They painted them as fools and knaves, didn't they?
That was the standard portrayal. And for centuries, that biased narrative was pretty much all anyone had.
Until
the late 18th, early 19th centuries. A few original Gnostic documents started surfacing in Europe. Just a handful.
But enough to raise doubts.
Enough to compel serious scholars, von Harnack, Reitzenstein, Bauer, to start questioning those established hostile accounts, to challenge the narrative.
And it wasn't just academics pushing this.
No, you had esotericists too. Madame Blavatsky, G.R.S. Mead, they did a lot to spark public interest. Some French esotericists, like Pappas and Jules Doinel, even tried to reconstitute the Gnostic Church.
But nothing really compared to the impact of finding the Nag Hammadi library itself.
Nothing at all. That sheer wealth of primary documents just sparked a whole new era of research. It spilled out of academia into popular culture novels, sci-fi, websites, a huge surge of public interest.
So, given this resurgence, it feels really important to define what gnosis actually means. We hear the word knowledge.
Right, from the Greek, its opposite, agnostic, is probably more familiar to most people.
But gnosis isn't just intellectual knowledge, is it? Not rational or philosophical in the usual sense.
No, not primarily. And it's certainly not about data access or information.
Mm-hmm.
The scholar Elaine Pagels, she translates it quite effectively as insight,
Insight, okay.
meaning an intuitive kind of knowing, psychological, metaphysical cognition, something deeper than just intellect.
And Gnosticism itself, it wasn't monolithic. There were diverse movements.
Definitely diverse.
Yeah.
Yet there was an undeniable central core, as Hall puts it, something uniting them.
Which was?
A shared dedication to Jesus Christ. Now, their understanding of Christ was often radically different from mainstream Christianity, but that connection was there for many of them.
So when we talk about the Nag Hammadi texts, we often mean Christian Gnostics.
Typically, yes. But it's important to remember the term gnosis, and much of the worldview were shared by non-Christians too,
Like the pagan Gnostics.
who are perhaps more accurately called Hermeticists. They venerated Hermes Trismegistus as their savior figure, not Christ.
And then there's Jewish Gnosticism too.
Right. Earlier forms like Essene mysticism, Merkaba mysticism, and later evolving into Kabbalah. There are definite threads there.
But where did this whole unique Gnostic worldview actually come from? Was it borrowed from somewhere else?
Well, past theories looked for external influences, Persia, Greece, Egypt. But the contemporary view, championed by scholars like E.R. Dodds, C.G. Jung.
Jung, interesting.
Yes. They suggest Gnostic writings stem primarily from profound mystical experience.
Not just intellectual speculation.
No. Gilles Quispel, following Jung, specifically proposed Gnosticism, originated in the experience of the ontological self, a powerful blend of psychological and mystical insight.
And that kind of profound experience, it's hard to just write down plainly.
Exactly. Quispel noted it doesn't lend itself to, prosaic description. So what often happens is it gets projected outwards as mystically inspired religious mythology.
Which sounds exactly like what we find in the Gnostic texts.
It really does. Modern mythologists see these Gnostic myths as originating in genuine mystical experience, which distinguishes them from, say, later derivative myths or allegories.
So figures like Valentinus, Basilides, they weren't just making stuff up.
Not according to this view. They weren't idle speculators, as their critics claimed. They were inspired mystics, experiencing realities beyond ordinary perception.
Okay, so if Gnosticism springs from this deep mystical experience, what did that experience reveal? What was their view of the universe, our place in it? Let's unpack that Gnostic worldview.
It's certainly a deep critique of creation and deity. The Gnostics held what Hall calls a startling view of the world's imperfections.
How so? How did it differ from other views?
Well, think about Orthodox Christianity. You have a fallen world, sure, but the idea is you leave it at death. Or modern secularism, try to fix the world externally, often leading to, wars, ecological disasters, you name it.
Right, different approaches. So what was the Gnostic alternative?
They offered something radical. They believed the world is flawed because it was created in a flawed manner.
Created badly.
In essence, yes, or at least by a flawed creator. And their solution wasn't external fixing or just waiting to escape. It was internal.
Wow.
They believe the only effective way to improve the world is by improving human consciousness through the insight of gnosis.
So change starts within.
Exactly. They observe life suffering, much like Buddhists, actually recognizing that a huge chunk of it originates in the natural or cosmic order itself.
You mean things like?
Well, why do creatures have to eat each other to survive? Why are living beings wiped out by natural catastrophes, earthquakes, floods? Why do humans suffer from depression, alienation, boredom, even when they have everything they supposedly need?
These aren't easy questions.
No. And the Gnostics concluded the causes are inherent in the world's very fabric. It's a fundamental critique of the cosmos as we experience it.
And this critique extended to their concept of God, which you said was subtle, puzzling.
Very much so, especially for modern minds. Remember, they're coming out of this Semitic monotheistic background. They're confronting the Old Testament God,
Yahweh, right.
who in many passages appears micromanaging, capricious, wrathful. Hall describes him as a lawgiver, policeman, judge, and executioner.
Okay, so the Gnostics looked at this figure.
And they asked a central, almost blasphemous question. Is this flawed creator, the one responsible for this flawed world, truly the ultimate true and good God?
No.
Or, they dared to suggest, might he be a lesser deity, a sort of large but not very wise angel who is perhaps ignorant of a higher reality, or maybe even an imposter claiming ultimate authority?
Wow. That's a radical departure.
It is, and the Gnostic answer was pretty definitive. This creator God is not the ultimate true God.
So who is he?
He's a demiurge. The Greek word means craftsman, builder, an intermediate secondary deity.
And above him?
Above and beyond this demiurge, they believed, exists a true, ultimate, real, and good reality. Something totally transcendent, yet experienceable by the human spirit.
You can see why that was controversial.
Absolutely. But you can also see why this questioning of traditional God concepts might resonate today. Many people feel that same unease with conventional religious portrayals of the divine.
And this whole worldview, it must have shaped how they saw us, humans, our predicament.
Profoundly. Gnostics believed human nature mirrors the world's duality. We are partly made by this false creator, the demiurge.
You're from the stuff of this flawed world.
Right. But crucially, we also contain within us a light, a spark, from the true God.
The divine spark.
Exactly. A spirit that is, in essence, older than this created world, imprisoned within it.
But we're mostly unaware of this spark.
Most of the time, yes.
Wow.
We remain ignorant of it. And awakening it, they believed, involves overcoming powerful obstacles.
Obstacles built into the system.
Built into our nature, our environment. Gnostic wisdom even hinted these obstacles might be connected to the powers managing the universe. The archons, the rulers.
Powers whose dominion over us would be threatened if we achieved Gnosis.
That's the implication. It really echoes what some scholars call the Gnostic Paul. The Apostle Paul's writings about struggling not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Interesting connection. So death releases the spark.
And frees the divine spark from its physical prison, yes. But the Gnostics believed that release might only be temporary. Unless liberating knowledge, Gnosis had been attained while here on Earth. Without that, the cycle might just continue.
They also had categories for humanity, didn't they? Based on spiritual potential.
Yes, 3 main types, which interestingly resemble some modern psychological profiles.
What were they?
First, he has the pneumatics. These are the spiritual individuals, a relatively small number, who are ready for Gnosis and liberation. They resonate with spirit.
New.
Okay, spiritually inclined. Then, at the opposite end, you have the Hyaletics. These are the earth-bound, the materialistic. Hyal means matter. They only recognize physical reality.
And in the middle?
The Psychics. These are people who live largely in their mental, emotional nature. Psyche. They tend to rely on external rules, laws, ethics, expecting those things to redeem them, rather than aspiring to higher, direct, salvific states of consciousness.
So it's like a spectrum of awareness.
Exactly. And crucially, there's potential for development, a progression from materialistic slavery to the senses.
The hyalitic state.
Through a kind of ethical religiosity. The ultimate spiritual freedom brought by liberating Gnosis, the pneumatic state. Gilles Quispel put it beautifully. The world's spirit in exile must go through the inferno of matter and the purgatory of morals to arrive at the spiritual paradise.
Wow. So what does this all imply about our fundamental nature?
It implies something radical. The Gnostics believe the essential nature of the human being is divine.
Divine. Not just created by God, but actually divine.
Yes. This is a sharp contrast to mainstream orthodoxy, which usually sees the human soul as a creation, fundamentally different from and lesser than the deity.
So more like Eastern ideas.
Exactly. It resonates strongly with concepts like Hinduism's Atman being Brahman, or the Mahayana Buddhist idea of the Buddha nature inherent in all beings. The Gnostics saw men and women as essentially gods and goddesses who have simply forgotten who they are.
So the human predicament is forgetting.
Forgetting, combined with physical limitations. Hall talks about a triple ignorance. Ignorance of our true origins, ignorance of our true divine nature, and ignorance of our ultimate destiny.
And Gnosis is the cure for that ignorance.
Precisely. It's the insight that frees us from this predicament.
Okay, let's shift focus then. If Gnosis is the key, how did they see this salvation through insight working? What is this liberating Gnosis?
There's a fantastic early Gnostic statement, often quoted, that defines it perfectly.
What does it say?
What makes us free is the gnosis of who we were, of what we have become, of where we were, of wherein we have been cast, of whereto we are hastening, of what we are being freed, of what birth really is, of what rebirth really is.
That covers pretty much everything. Who we were, what we are, where we're going.
All the fundamental existential questions. The idea is, if you can intuitively receive accurate answers to those questions, that is liberating Gnosis.
It's liberation through understanding your true situation.
Exactly. If ignorance is what enslaves us, ignorance orchestrated perhaps by the Demiurge and his archons, then the knowledge, the insight that removes that ignorance is what brings liberation.
Hall uses the metaphor of a malefic cocoon of ignorance.
Yes, and Gnosis unravels that cocoon,
Yeah.
allowing you to finally stand in the sunlight of the true God, the ultimate reality beyond the flawed creation.
Now, does this mean it's all up to the individual? Just figure it out yourself.
Not entirely. While intensely individual, Gnostics generally believed liberating Gnosis couldn't be achieved solely through your own efforts. They held that we require help.
Help from where?
From messengers, from saviors. Though, importantly, your own efforts remain absolutely essential. It's not passive.
How does that compare to, say, the Orthodox Christian view of salvation?
It's quite different. Mainstream Christianity typically posits that Jesus saved humanity primarily through his suffering and death on the cross, atoning for sin.
And the Gnostics saw Jesus differently.
Very differently. They saw him as a great helper, yes, but his role was primarily to assist humans in attaining liberating Gnosis. He was a revealer of secrets, a guide back to the light.
And was he the only one?
No. Gnostics didn't generally believe Jesus was the only such salvific helper. They spoke of other messengers of light figures like Seth, Adam's third son in some traditions, or the later Iranian prophet Mani, who emerged from the true God throughout history to aid humanity's quest for this salvific knowledge.
So the goal wasn't escaping sin in the conventional sense.
Not primarily. They sought release more from unconsciousness and incomprehension, as Hall puts it, primarily ignorance of spiritual realities. Salvation or liberation was seen as this potential inherent in everyone.
An individual potential.
Intensely individual, yes, and stimulated not just by the messengers' deaths, but crucially by their lives and their teachings. The knowledge they imparted was key.
You mentioned help being required. What form did that take?
Well, the ministry of these messengers was typically seen as twofold. First, they provided teachings, parables, dialogues, myths, designed to guide minds and hearts toward Gnosis.
Okay, the intellectual and emotional preparation.
Right. But second, and maybe even more crucially for some groups, they conferred liberating mysteries, sacraments, rituals.
Mysteries, like secret ceremonies.
Exactly. Things which, through a kind of mystic grace or initiation, were believed to impart the fullness of Gnosis, sealing it within the spirit forever.
For a long time, wasn't the nature of these mysteries really speculative? Didn't scholars dismiss them?
Yes, for centuries. Many scholars, influenced by the heresiologists, dismissed the Gnostic myths and sacraments as immature, maybe even degenerate, compared to philosophy or orthodox theology.
But recent research.
Recent research, especially fueled by the Nag Hammadi texts, has thoroughly debunked those older contentions. We now see that myth and sacrament weren't just incidental window dressing. They were the absolute heart and essence of Gnostic spirituality for many.
Do we have examples?
The Gospel of Philip, found at Nag Hammadi, is practically an entire volume dedicated to Gnostic sacramental theology. It talks about rites like the bridal chamber, anointing, baptism.
So Gnosticism wasn't just a philosophy club.
Far from it. It reveals Gnosticism as a full-fledged religious tradition. It had its own myths, its own powerful sacramental mysteries, likely a priesthood or lineage of initiates, and a distinct spiritual lineage. It was much more structured than just a purely individualistic, do-it-yourself spirituality.
This brings us to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of a Gnostic renaissance happening now.
Yes. Hall observes this modest Gnostic renaissance in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. There's a growing interest, both scholarly and popular.
And he draws a parallel to another historical renaissance.
He does. He speculates that this Gnostic renaissance might parallel the great Hermetic humanistic renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe.
How so?
Just as the rediscovery of lost Hermetic texts back then fueled a massive cultural and intellectual rebirth.
Right, influencing art, philosophy, science.
Exactly. Hall suggests the rediscovery of these Gnostic scriptures in our time could potentially lead to similar results. A spiritual deepening, perhaps a cultural shift.
He has that quote, "The stone that the builders rejected."
May become the cornerstone once more. What the blindness of churchly politics rejected nearly 2,000 years ago may find its way into the spirituality of the new century. It's a very hopeful, compelling thought.
It really is. Which leads us nicely into this idea of Gnosticism as the key to esoteric Christianity, this notion of it bridging extremes.
This is really Hall's central insight, the core of his book's title. He sees Gnosticism as the key to understanding esoteric Christianity.
What does he mean by that?
He argues pretty strongly that without Gnosticism, all the non-mainstream spiritual structures of alternative mystical Christianity fall like a house of cards.
So it's foundational.
In his view, yes.
Yeah.
The wisdom of the knowing ones, for Hall, is the original esoteric Christianity. To disregard the Gnostics is to ignore a vital, perhaps the vital resource for understanding the inner core, the mystical heart of the Christian faith in a non-literal way.
And he mentions groups where Gnosticism or related ideas survived.
Right, it's not entirely extinct. He points to the Mandaeans, still found in Iraq and Iran, who have Gnostic roots. And historically, groups like the Cathars or Albigensians in medieval Europe who faced brutal extermination attempts, but carried on related traditions.
So what was the big intellectual problem Gnosticism was trying to solve back in its heyday? What was the context?
Well, the philosophical world of the 1st century AD was really grappling with this tension between Plato and Aristotle.
Plato's universals.
Right. Grand patterns, invisible causes, archetypes, versus Aristotle's focus on tangibles, knowable facts, visible effects, empirical observation.
Two very different ways of seeing the world.
And they never fully reconciled them. There was this sense of unfinished business, Hall calls it, a huge, seemingly irreconcilable interval between universals and particulars that really burdened intellectual thought.
How does the invisible cause become the visible effect?
Exactly. The human mind was desperately seeking a bridge between these two extremes. They seemed mentally incompatible, yet nature clearly reconciled them somehow. That was the big challenge.
And Gnosticism offered a solution.
It offered a revolutionary approach through its core concept of emanationism.
Emanationism, what does that mean?
It's basically a philosophy where the two qualities, spirit and matter, universal and particular, don't just abruptly meet. Instead, they're brought together by extension or procession.
Like flowing out.
Kind of. Think of it like a spectrum or a descending ladder. Universals don't just become particulars directly. Things become gradually less spiritual as they descend from the ultimate divine source, and gradually less material as they ascend from base matter.
So there are intermediate stages, degrees.
Precisely. Degrees and conditions. This approach allowed for the possibility that these apparent opposites could actually meet on some common ground somewhere in the middle of that spectrum.
Did this resonate with other philosophies?
Well, Hall notes that emanationism often assumes two co-eternal realities, spirit and matter. Aristotle, who saw both as immortal, would find some common ground there.
And even churchmen.
Some, perhaps.
Yes.
Especially those who held beliefs in the eternal nature of both good and evil, heaven and hell. The idea of co-eternal opposites wasn't entirely alien.
It raises fascinating questions, though. Is spirit just super refined matter? Is matter just dense spirit?
Exactly. Are they just different degrees of one underlying essence or totally irreconcilable opposites? And then you get into absence versus presence. Is darkness the absence of light or its own principle? Is hunger the absence of food? Time versus eternity.
Philosophical rabbit holes.
Deep ones. And how you answer often depends on your underlying philosophical school.
Okay, so into this already complex mix comes the early Christian concept of God. How did that fit or not fit?
Well, most pagan systems, Greek, Egyptian, saw the supreme spiritual power as somehow identical with the substance of space itself. A complete fullness, not emptiness. What we perceive as nothing was just no thing, the abstraction before forms arise. Universal life, unconditioned.
God is the universe, in a sense.
Or the universe is the body of God. But the early Christian church, particularly as it developed its orthodoxy, took a very different stance.
How so?
They viewed deity as entirely separate from creation. God was a distinct person outside the world he formed, ruling from an extra-universal throne, exercising what Hall calls the absolute tyranny of the divine will.
So, for pagans, God emerges through creation. For Christians, God creates from outside.
That's the fundamental difference Hall highlights. For pagans, God unfolded through spiritual and material generations. For Christians, he was this separate, almost alien force imposing order.
Then where did the Gnostics land in this?
This is where they got into trouble. They actually aligned more with the pagan groups in believing the universe is the body of God, that spiritual power manifests within creation as a constant impulse toward unfoldment.
Okay, so far so pagan.
But at the same time, they tried to use these fundamentally pagan emanationist frameworks to explain Christian mystical philosophy.
Trying to bridge the gap again.
Exactly. And the result, Hall puts it bluntly, they succeeded in offending both the pagans and the Christians. Each side felt their core viewpoint was being compromised or misinterpreted.
Stuck in the middle, which explains why Gnosticism became known as the Great Heresy.
The Great Heresy of the ante-Nicene period, absolutely. The early church fathers, who were rapidly consolidating power and defining dogma, saw themselves as the sole custodians of salvation. They vehemently worked to stamp out any philosophical, non-literal interpretations of Christianity.
And they particularly disliked the Gnostics pointing out uncomfortable truths.
Like the non-Christian sources and elements, Greek philosophy, Egyptian mystery traditions, Chaldean astrology that clearly contributed to the nascent Christian sect, that threatened the church's claim to unique divine revelation.
The attacks were quite vicious, weren't they?
Astounding, really. Hall points out the irony. These early bishops were preaching brotherly love, yet simultaneously formulating these vicious and slanderous attacks on anyone who disagreed. They implied any dissenting view must come from a perverse spirit, basically the devil.
Which put the Gnostics in a terrible position.
Extremely precarious, as Hall says. They were trying to be reconcilers, peacemakers, bridging these extremes. But they were despised by the church for interpreting Christian mysticism through pagan lenses.
And
simultaneously opposed by some contemporary pagan philosophers, especially certain Neoplatonists, because they seemed to accept, even partially, what those philosophers saw as the unphilosophic and illogical tenets brought by these new Christian enthusiasts.
Attacked from both sides.
Caught in the crossfire. And ultimately, as Hall notes, they were gradually crushed by the sheer weight of numbers. Gnosticism largely faded from mainstream view after centuries of this desperate struggle.
But the irony is how their teaching survived at all.
It's profound. Gnosticism is almost entirely indebted to its enemies for the preservation of any record of its teachings, at least until Nag Hammadi.
Because the church fathers wrote detailed condemnations.
Exactly. In their zeal to refute and destroy Gnosticism, they quoted extensively from Gnostic texts, described their doctrines in detail, and those condemnations survived. What was meant to erase actually preserved. These became invaluable resources for later students of comparative religion.
An incredible historical twist. Now let's talk about some of the key figures involved and the Gnostic cosmic drama they described. Who were the main players?
Among the many names associated with Gnosticism, 3 really stand out in the early period: Simon Magus, Basilides, and Valentinus.
And our source describes them as
men of exceptional brilliance. But because of that brilliance, they were singled out for particular and continued persecution.
Simon Magus seems to get the worst press.
He really does. The Syrian Gnostic. He was subjected to this incredibly spiteful and unchristian tirade of abuse. His character was just shredded by the church fathers. They painted him as a power-hungry sorcerer, an example of utter depravity.
Why such venom?
Hall suggests this level of vitriol was necessary for the church fathers to explain away anything in early accounts, even the book of Acts, that contradicted their evolving dogma about apostolic succession and authority. Simon represented a rival power structure.
But Basilides and Valentinus were different.
Apparently so. They possessed such exceptional personal integrity, according to historical accounts, that even their fiercest critics in the church couldn't find anything really negative to say about their personal lives.
Which ironically made them more dangerous.
Exactly. It made them, in the church's eyes, heresiarchs of the most deadly kind. Why? Because they supposedly concealed their diabolical perversities behind an appearance of virtue and integrity.
It's almost comical logic. If a pagan is virtuous, it must be the devil in disguise.
It does seem that way. Hall argues this whole situation strongly suggests that if any group held the genuine esoteric secrets or inner teachings of the early church, it was likely the Gnostics.
Because they maintained high ethical and rational standards.
Yes, which made them most formidable adversaries to the temporal power of Christian theology, which was becoming increasingly dogmatic and literal.
What was their central idea, this ascent of the soul?
That's a core concept. The ascent of the soul through successive stages or spheres of being. It's a doctrine with deep roots, likely originating in Babylonian astrology, the worship of stars and planets.
With its series of heavens, planetary gods.
Right, and the idea that the soul needs magical passwords or knowledge to pass through each sphere on its journey after death, or even during mystical ascent.
You see this latter concept everywhere, don't you?
It's remarkably universal. Hall lists parallels. The Egyptian ritual of the dead, the Babylonian myth of Ishtar descending to the underworld, the Poimandres of Hermes Trismegistus with its 7 planetary governors.
Jacob's ladder in Genesis.
The 9 royal arches of Enoch in Masonic lore, the 7 heavens in St. John's Revelations, Muhammad's night journey climbing through 7 gates guarded by patriarchs. It's a pervasive archetype.
Even connections to Buddhism.
Possibly. Bartisanes, one of the later Gnostics, described Christ descending through 7 worlds, taking on a body appropriate to each plane, literally becoming all things unto all men. Hall sees a parallel here to the Bodhisattva concept.
And the ultimate goal.
The ultimate Gnostic aspiration for many was the soul being reabsorbed into the ultimate abstract state of the true Godhead, which Hall sees as perfectly analogous to Buddhist nirvana, that condition of not being, transcending all conditioned existence.
Valentinus had that quote describing his vision.
Yes, a beautiful encapsulation of emanationism. I behold all things suspended in air by spirit. The flesh I see suspended from soul, but the soul shining out from air. And air depends upon ether, and fruits produced from bythos, profundity. It's all about the birth of lower natures from their superiors, creation emerging stage by stage from its ultimate cause.
So how did they structure the Godhead itself in this emanationist view?
Well, the simplest Gnostic arrangement starts with the universal logos, described sometimes as he who stood, stands, and will stand.
The eternal principle.
Right, a noble and pure nature, but it projects an image, a thought, that ordains all things. From this logos, Simon Magus, for example, posited 3 fundamental aspects or hypotheses.
Which were?
Incorruptible form, the great thought, or ennoia, and the universal mind, nous. Note that thought precedes mind here.
Interesting order, and later Gnostics developed this.
Yes, into concepts like anthropos, the archetypal heavenly man. Anthropos, the son of Anthracos, and then this rather key figure, Yaldabaoth.
Yaldabaoth. Yeah.
Often described as the son of chaos. He's the Demiurge, the craftsman or lord of the lower world. Think of him as the Zeus equivalent in Orphic or Platonic metaphysics. This is the prince of this world that Jesus refers to in the Gospels.
The ruler of the flawed creation.
Exactly. He's seen as the personification of matter, the ruling consciousness or monad of the material sphere.
And he wasn't alone.
No. Out of himself, Yaldabaoth generated 6 sons. And these 7 beings, Yaldabaoth plus his 6 sons, became the 7 planetary spirits, the archons, the governors of the lower spheres.
Yaldabaoth himself, often associated with Saturn.
Right. And his sons with the other planets known to the ancients, Jupiter, Thebaoth Mars, Adoniasan, Astaphios Venus, Alaus Mercury, Uranus Moon. This connects to Greek myths like Saturn devouring his children, planetary substance being drawn into Saturn's rings and then scattered.
But the Gnostic view of these archons was different from, say, the Shemitic view.
Critically different, yes. In Hermetic allegory, these 7 guardians or builders, the Elohim in Genesis perhaps, were often seen as neutral manifestors of the divine plan, doing their job, essentially.
But for the Gnostics?
For many Gnostics, Yaldabaoth and his sons were not neutral. They were proud and opposing spirits. Like Lucifer and his rebellious angels, they sought to establish their own kingdom in the lower realms, in opposition to the true God above.
Which explains Yaldabaoth's boast.
Exactly. His cry, "There are no other gods before me," is seen by Gnostics as the ultimate arrogance, the ignorance of the limited creator who doesn't realize he is but the least part, the lowest echo, of the true triune Godhead above.
To really grasp this, maybe we should walk through the Gnostic Genesis story. C.W. King summarized one version.
Yes, it's complex but revealing. It starts with Sophia Achamoth. She represents the lower generative wisdom of the world, an emanation from the higher heavenly Sophia.
And she falls.
She's lured into the abyss, the primordial chaos, by seeing her own reflection in the darkness. She unites with this darkness and gives birth to Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos and the egg, imperfect because of his mixed heritage.
Sophia Achamoth herself is spiritual, though.
Yes, so she suffers terribly from this contact with matter and darkness. She eventually escapes, struggles upwards to a middle distance between the spiritual world, the pleroma, the fullness above, and the world of ignorance and matter below. She cleanses herself and builds a barrier, the firmament, protecting the higher realms. But she remains cut off from her own source.
Thank you for listening to the Urban Odyssey podcast. If you enjoy the content we release, please consider supporting us by subscribing to our Substack. A monthly membership is only $5 per month. If you decide to buy a year-long membership, it's only $50 for the entire year. Purchase a membership now at the official urban.substack.com. Again, that is the official urban.substack.com. You can also find all of my free resources that I share, such as free books, links, documentaries, and more, at bio.link/officialurban. Again, that's bio.link/officialurban. Now, let's get back to the audio.
The heavenly Sophia,
Leaving Ealdabaoth behind.
left alone in the darkness and chaos. He then becomes the creator of the physical world, the realm where sin temporarily prevailed. He mirrors a higher creation, but imperfectly. He produces his 6 planetary spirits, his sons, fashioned in his own image, each becoming progressively darker and more material as they recede from him. It reflects Plato's theory of proximity: the further from the source, the less perfect.
And these 7 rule the lower spheres.
Yes, the 7 regions from Sophia Achamoth's middle space down to our Earth, which is the 7th region, referring more to the ethereal plane surrounding Earth than the physical globe itself.
What drives Ealdabaoth?
He's a mix. He has some spiritual instinct inherited from his mother, Sophia Achamoth, but also ambition and pride derived from the darkness and matter. He becomes arrogant, severs himself from his mother's influence, and decides to create man.
Why?
He intends this creature, man, to reflect his demiurgic powers, to serve him and acknowledge matter as the ultimate reality, the Lord of creation.
But he fails.
Utterly. His initial creation is a monster, a huge but soulless creature, inert. His sons grade to him, demanding he animate it. But Ealdabaoth, being only a secondary deity, cannot create life or spirit on his own.
So what does he do?
In his extremity, desperate to make his creation work, he does something fateful. He bestows upon man the only divine light he possesses, the ray he himself inherited unknowingly from his mother, Sophia Achamoth.
He gives away his own spark.
Yes, and this spark, this generative wisdom, instantly elevates man. Man now possesses a higher consciousness than his creator. He sees himself as a god and refuses to recognize Ealdabaoth as his master.
How does Ealdabaoth react?
He's punished for his failure and presumption, forced to sacrifice his absolute kingship. Meanwhile, Sophia Achamoth, seeing the divine spark in man, favors humanity. This spark transforms man's appearance, making him resemble Anthropos, the primal heavenly man whose nature is pure light and truth.
Ealdabaoth must have been furious.
Enraged, his jealousy and rage reflect into the abyss, into the darkness, and this gives birth to Satan, or Ophiomorphos, the embodiment of envy and cunning in the form of a serpent.
The adversary.
Right. Ealdabaoth, realizing man's power lies in Sophia's protection and the inner spark, tries to trap him. He creates illusions, snares, and most famously, forbids man to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, fearing man might discover the mysteries of the superior worlds and escape his grasp.
But Sophia intervenes again.
Yes. She sends her own genius, Office, also in the form of a serpent, the serpent of wisdom this time, to induce man to transgress Ealdabaoth's unjust command.
So the serpent in the Gnostic Eden is good.
Or at least an agent of liberation. Man eats the fruit, and his eyes are opened. He suddenly comprehends the mysteries of creation, his own divine potential.
And Ealdabaoth's response? Punishment.
Retaliation. He punishes Adam and Eve, casting them down, imprisoning their luminous spirits within physical bodies, the coats of skin, the dungeon of matter.
But Sophia doesn't abandon them.
No, she continues to protect humanity secretly, establishing a current of divine light, an internal illumination, flowing between her celestial region and mankind trapped below.
This cosmic drama continues then.
Absolutely. Sophia, fearing darkness will ultimately prevail and extinguish the sparks of light trapped in matter, appeals upwards to the heavenly Sophia, her mother, and ultimately to the unknown depth, the everlasting Father, the true God, for a savior. Ealdabaoth and his archons are weaving this web of fate, of ignorance, trying to shut out divine wisdom completely. The challenge is, how can a redeemer enter Ealdabaoth's physical creation without violating its laws, without being trapped himself?
How did they solve that?
According to this Gnostic narrative, Ealdabaoth himself had to be unknowingly tricked into creating the vessel. Sophia Achamoth appealed to the Demiurge's pride, convincing him he should create a good and just man named Jesus, supposedly to uphold his law.
So Ealdabaoth creates Jesus' body.
Yes. Once this pure vessel, Jesus, was fashioned, the true Soter, the Savior Christos, who was an emanation of the Father of Fathers and the heavenly wisdom, could descend.
How?
Invisibly, secretly. He passed down through the 7 spheres ruled by the archons, cleverly assuming a form appropriate to each sphere to conceal his true luminous nature from the rulers. In each world, he gathered scattered sparks of light, uniting them within himself.
Until he reached Jesus.
Until he descended into the man Jesus at his baptism in the Jordan. This moment marks the age of the great miracle, when the divine Savior fully inhabited the human form.
What happens when Ealdabaoth finds out?
He discovers the Soter's presence within Jesus, realizes he's been tricked, becomes enraged. He incites the people, uses his material forces, like the rulers of the world, to destroy the physical body that Christus was using.
The crucifixion.
Yes. But before departing that physical form, the Soter Christos implanted a deep understanding of the great mysteries into the souls of receptive individuals, opening the pathway, the gate, between the lower material universe and the higher spiritual universes forever.
And after the ascension?
Christ ascended, not necessarily all the way back to the pleroma immediately, but to the middle space, Sophia Achamoth's realm. There, symbolically, he sits on the right hand of Yaldabaoth, but unperceived by him, continuing his work, collecting all the souls, the sparks of light, that are purified by attaining Gnosis, by Christ's knowledge. When all the spiritual light has been gathered out of Yaldabaoth's flawed empire,
Then the redemption will be accomplished and the world will be destroyed. Not necessarily in fire and brimstone, but through the reabsorption of all spiritual light back into the pleroma, the fullness from which it originally descended, leaving the material shell empty.
So this Gnostic Christianity offered a path that didn't rely
On an exoteric clergy, or external church hierarchy in the same way. Christ, the Soter, was the true high priest whose descent shattered the old world order controlled by Yaldabaoth. Religion became primarily an internal adjustment, an awakening.
Old rituals became meaningless.
Rituals meant merely to propitiate Yaldabaoth or appease the archons were seen as valueless, yes. But the Gnostic mystic sacraments, believed to be instituted by the Christos himself, were vital. They were tools to facilitate the knowledge of the truth,
Replacing fear with light.
replacing the rule of fear and darkness with love and light. But, as Hall dryly points out, the emerging Orthodox Church saw this emphasis on internal knowledge and potentially bypassing priestly authority as economically unsound.
It threatened their power structure tremendously. And Hall concludes the Gnostics were eventually destroyed, largely lest their philosophy render useless the temporal power of the Christian Church.
A sobering thought. Let's turn now to one of the most iconic, if enigmatic, Gnostic symbols, Abraxas.
Ah, yes, Abraxas, a fascinating figure and a concept often attributed to Basilides, the great Egyptian Gnostic teacher.
It's more than just a name, right? There's numerology involved.
Absolutely. Abraxas, bibohia in Greek, consists of 7 letters. This number 7 is immediately significant, representing the 7 creative powers, the planetary angels, or archons.
And the letters themselves add up.
Yes. Using Greek isopsephy, where letters have numerical values, the letters of Abraxas add up to 365.
A number of days in a year.
Exactly. Which links Abraxas to the 365 eons, or great spiritual cycles that were thought to make up the nature of the Supreme Father in some Gnostic systems. It strongly connects the symbol to the solar principle, much like the god Mithras, also associated with 365.
And the image itself is very distinctive, a composite figure.
Very. You typically see a figure with a rooster's head.
Representing.
For Nisa's foresight, vigilance. The rooster heralds the dawn, the coming light. Then 2 arms, often holding a whip or club and a shield.
Power and wisdom.
Dynamis, power, and Sophia, wisdom, yes. The active and passive extensions of the soul. The body is human, suggesting these divine powers find their perfection in humanity, that man is the natural form of God.
And the legs.
The legs are serpents. These represent nous, intuitive wisdom, mind, and logos, understanding, the word, the intellectual powers that support creation. For initiates, it was a powerful graphic representation of the components of divine nature and potentially human nature, too.
Given the persecution, how did symbols like this even survive? You mentioned the church trying to eradicate Gnosticism.
It's largely thanks to, ironically, cupidity, as Hall puts it, greed.
How so?
While the fanatics sought to destroy every intelligible record, scrolls, books, they often couldn't bring themselves to destroy articles of actual commercial value, like gemstones.
Ah, the Gnostic gems.
Exactly. These engraved gems, often intaglios made of carnelian, crystal, bloodstone, sometimes set in rings, were apparently used by Gnostics.
As identification.
Possibly as a means of identification for members of what was likely a secret society. They needed to be small, inconspicuous. The engravings often featured Greek letters, forming magic words or names of God surrounding a central design like Abraxas.
And these survived because they were valuable.
Precisely. Their material value saved them from the flames that consumed the manuscripts.
Are they common now?
No, exceedingly rare. Found in major collections like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris or the Vatican. And you have to be careful later, more finely crafted copies were made during the Italian Renaissance.
How do you tell the difference?
Ironically, the authentic ancient Gnostic gems are often quite crudely carved, maybe with a coarse wheel. The Renaissance copies are artistically superior, but lack the original meaning and context. So crudeness can actually be a sign of antiquity here.
Did they serve other purposes besides identification?
Oh, likely. They probably functioned as amulets against evil, talismans conferring power, maybe even seals for documents. The scholar C.W. King, who studied them extensively, noted the mingling of symbols, Gnostic, Egyptian, Syrian, Kabbalistic, Mithraic, suggesting a complex interplay of influences.
A real syncretism.
Definitely. King even believed some elements had Hindu origins, traveling along those trade routes we discussed.
Did anyone try to categorize these gems?
Yes, the antiquarian Bernard de Montfaucon classified them into 7 broad categories in the 18th century.
What were they?
1. Gems with the true Abraxas symbol. 2. Gems featuring a lion, often with a serpent body representing the lion-faced light Aeon, sometimes a Christ symbol. 3. Figures and inscriptions relating to the god Serapis.
Serapis, the Alexandrian god.
Yes. 4. Symbols borrowed directly from older Egyptian religion. 5. Gems depicting various human figures. 6. Gems with inscriptions only, prayers, vowel patterns, magic names. And 7. Miscellaneous unusual designs.
So even within the Abraxas category, there was variation.
Lots. Abraxas might be shown riding a chariot or seated, sometimes with symbols of the sun and moon, often accompanied by names of archangels like Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, Raphael, or other divine names like Sambaoth.
And the lion-headed serpent, you said it was a Christ symbol for some.
Yes, Gnostics connected the lion to the lion of the tribe of Judah, but it was also a time symbol. The serpent body being the sun's winding path through the zodiac, the lion's head its power when exalted in the sign of Leo during summer.
What about other symbols? Egyptian ones?
Montfaucon's plates show figures like Harpocrates, the child god of silence, often seated on a lotus, Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls, scare beetles, sphinxes, the Ouroboros, the tail-devouring serpent of eternity.
Harpocrates, a god of discretion.
Yes, the child holding a finger to his lips. A powerful symbol for initiates. Keep quiet while you're on the inside. Do not talk in church, as Hall interprets it. Silence and secrecy were vital.
And the serpent.
The Ophites, a Gnostic sect, specifically venerated the serpent, connecting it to wisdom, healing, like Moses' brazen serpent, and even seeing it as a symbol for Christ himself, the great initiator.
There was another strange relic mentioned, the leaden book.
Ah, yes. Very rare. Small books, maybe 3 by 4 inches, with pages made of thin lead leaves, engraved with symbols and inscriptions.
What were they for?
Only 2 were really well documented. King theorized they contained prayers and magical formulas, perhaps intended to help the souls of the dead navigate the afterlife, addressing the planetary deities of the spheres, sort of a condensed, portable version of the elaborate Egyptian funerary manuscripts like the Book of the Dead.
Fascinating. Before we leave key figures, tell us more about Basilides' specific contributions. He seemed less focused on evil.
That's right. Basilides and his son Isidorus claimed instruction from Glaucius, supposedly a disciple of St. Peter himself, showing Gnostics believed Christ did communicate deeper, true teachings to his advanced disciples.
And his system differed.
He significantly downplayed the role of an active evil principle in the universe. He followed the Egyptian perspective, finding the idea of a supreme deity creating evil inherently offensive and illogical.
So how did creation happen, in his view?
From spiritual seeds existing latent within unconditioned reality, within the Godhead. These seeds unfolded, producing 3 primary creative agencies: a trinity, which then fashioned a 3-part world, the divine principles above, the material universe below, and crucially, a mysterious middle power or region that engendered mankind.
Man in the middle again.
Yes, living in this middle distance, containing potentials from both the superior spiritual creation and the inferior material one. Man cannot ascend directly to the pleroma, but must grow and evolve within the world provided for him.
And help comes.
Help comes via a redeemer for Basilides' followers. This was the Christos sent down by the divine power. This redeemer reveals the necessary secrets and initiates souls through mysteries. It really highlights Gnosticism as a profound psychological and spiritual discipline focused on inner unfoldment.
This all seems to point towards Alexandria as a major center for these ideas. Let's talk about that city, Alexandria, a crucible of mysticism, learning, and conflict.
Alexandria was truly unique. Founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BC, its location made it a crossroads.
A melting pot.
Absolutely.
Really?
Greeks, Romans, Jews, Egyptians, Syrians, people from further east, all living and interacting there. It became this incredible polyglot system of culture, attracting scholars, philosophers, mystics, scientists from all over the known world.
And secrecy was part of the culture, the mystery system.
Very much so. The idea of an outer teaching for the public and an inner secret teaching for initiates bound by oaths was prevalent. Egyptian traditions, Greek mysteries, esoteric Jewish groups, and certainly the Gnostic schools all operated on this principle. Even after Christianity arrived, this deep-seated tradition of holding sacred beliefs privately meant the city was always permeated with esoteric doctrines.
Did the authorities like that? Secret societies?
Not particularly. The Roman government especially was wary of secret societies. Their power seemed magnified precisely because it was uncertain, hidden, and memberships often overlapped, creating complex networks. While the philosophical schools were generally tolerant of each other, the very act of learning, especially esoteric learning with high moral standards, was viewed with suspicion by the less informed masses and by the pragmatic Roman rulers.
Why the suspicion?
The Romans, focused on military conquest and empire, perhaps feared that a secret government of the enlightened, guided by philosophy and mystical insight, might challenge the authority of the Caesars. Knowledge is power, after all.
And this mix of beliefs created some unique outcomes.
It created a ferment. You had Jewish monotheism rubbing shoulders with Greek and Egyptian pantheism and polytheism, and then Christian Trinitarianism entering the mix. It led to some truly exotic sects and philosophical syntheses. Hall quotes someone saying Alexandria was where sages of many lands assembled in Egypt to die a second time, meaning their old separate traditions died and were reborn in new blended forms.
Were there any unifying figures or symbols?
Yes. Certain deities became acceptable across different groups, acting as symbolic bridges. Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god, often depicted as sorrowful, the weeping god.
And Isis.
And Isis, absolutely central, the lady of all, the queen of the inhabited world, embodying truth, wisdom, and love. She was revered under countless names. Even as Christianity grew, parallels were drawn. Serapis' suffering linked to the crucified Messiah, Isis identified with the Virgin Mary.
The city was also known for its spectacles.
Magnificent public festivals. Calixtus wrote an amazing account of one procession involving mythological figures, gods, historical impersonations, even costly sham fights. It showcased the immense wealth of the Ptolemaic rulers and the vibrant, if sometimes chaotic, cultural life.
But the real legacy lies in its library.
Oh, the libraries, the jewels of the ancient world. First, the Bruchion, part of the Mausian complex. Completed by the early Ptolemies, it might have held over 750,000 manuscripts by Julius Caesar's time.
Tragically destroyed.
Largely destroyed during Caesar's siege of Alexandria. Though H.P. Blavatsky, in her writings, recounts traditions that many precious scrolls were saved by librarians, perhaps hidden in secret caches, even fireproofed, because prophecies foretold the destruction.
And the second library.
The Serapeum, the daughter library, housed in the temple precinct of Serapis. It contained perhaps another 300,000 manuscripts.
And its fate, even more infamous.
Yes. It survived Caesar, but was eventually destroyed centuries later. The traditional account, most famously recounted by Gibbon, though debated by some historians, attributes its final burning to the Arab conquest in 641 A.D. by order of Caliph Omar.
The story about fuel for the baths.
That's the legend, that the manuscripts provided fuel for Alexandria's public baths for 6 months. Whether literally true or not, it symbolizes an unimaginable loss of intellectual heritage.
The concentration of scholars there was incredible.
Astounding. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference there. Strabo, the geographer, Hipparchus, the astronomer, Archimedes, the mathematician, Euclid, the geometer, they all used Alexandrian facilities.
Scientific breakthroughs, too.
Profound ones. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system there, centuries before Copernicus, though he was rejected at the time. Herophilus, a physician, discovered the brain is the seat of the mind, identified motor and sensory nerves, possibly even understood blood circulation knowledge lost and rediscovered much later. Alexandria was a center for scientific medicine, skilled surgery, even had a zoological park.
And it was a source for important religious texts.
Yes, much significant pseudepigraphal literature works attributed to ancient figures seems to have originated or been compiled in Alexandria. The Book of Enoch, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Book of Jubilees, Psalms of Solomon, and crucially, the Hermetic literature.
The writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus.
Exactly. Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, this figure blending the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, and the Greek messenger god Hermes, probably an allegorical figure embodying universal wisdom rather than a single historical person.
And the Hermetic writings.
Scholars see them as a blend of Platonism, Stoicism, and Oriental mystical concepts. Later, the tradition expanded to include alchemy, Kabbalism, ceremonial magic. The core texts, like the Corpus Hermeticum, including the Pymander, offer a scholarly, ethical, moral approach to spirituality, likely preserving genuine elements of the ancient Egyptian mysteries.
Christianity also established itself early in Alexandria.
Tradition says St. Mark preached there around 40 AD, leading to the establishment of perhaps the earliest formal Christian school. You also had figures like Philo Judaeus, a Hellenized Jew, whose allegorical interpretations of Scripture laid groundwork for later Christian fathers, and whose writings on the Essenes and Therapeutae gained new focus with the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery.
And the Christian school itself became influential.
The Catechetical School of Alexandria, yes, led by figures like Clement and Origen in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They championed allegorical interpretation of Christian Scripture, partly as a defense against Gnosticism and other heresies.
But this period also saw intense conflict.
Tragic conflicts. Figures like Cyril of Alexandria, a later bishop, were involved in the violent expulsion of Jews from the city, terrible rioting, and the bitter theological disputes that led to the condemnation and banishment of Nestorius. This actually caused Nestorian Christianity to spread eastward, reaching Persia, India, even China.
What about Clement of Alexandria himself?
An interesting figure, a Christian apologist who tried to reconcile Christian and pagan doctrines. He created his own form of Christian Gnosticism, but one that essentially downgraded the esoteric depth of Egyptian religion compared to Christianity. Hall suggests he might have been initiated into some mystery cults himself, but developed an extreme prejudice against classical learning, perhaps due to its perceived decadence.
And Origen.
An outstanding theologian, hugely influential but also controversial, and eventually condemned posthumously. Much of the controversy seems arcane now. He suffered persecution during his life as well.
And then there's the murder of Hypatia.
A truly dark chapter. Hypatia, born around 370 AD, was the brilliant leader of the Neoplatonic school after her father Theon. A respected mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, known for her intellect, beauty, and modesty.
And she was killed.
Brutally murdered in 415 AD, dragged from her chariot and killed in a church by a mob of Christian monks, followers of Bishop Cyril. Her death effectively marked the end of Alexandrian Neoplatonism's golden age, silencing that vital philosophical voice through violence.
Neoplatonism itself was significant there.
It reached its full maturity in Alexandria, primarily through Plotinus, who taught there before moving to Rome, and later figures like Proclus in Athens who carried the tradition.
What was its core idea?
The fundamental superiority of internal experience over external education. It emphasized discipline's cathartic practices to release the soul from the dominance of the intellect and emotions, to achieve mystical union, clearly influenced by Asiatic meditation techniques.
Like St. John of the Cross saying, all science transcending.
Exactly. That mystical insight goes beyond rational knowledge.
But Alexandria's golden age ended.
Ended tragically. Weakened by internal strife, it was conquered by the Persians under Chosroes in 619 AD, and then definitively by the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As for Caliph Omar in 641 AD. That's when the Serapeum Library met its final obliteration. Omar's alleged, quote, sums up the attitude that sadly often prevails when dogmatism confronts learning. If these books agree with the Quran, they are useless. If they disagree, they are pernicious. In either case, burn them.
A catastrophic end.
It marked the end of one of humanity's noblest intellectual and spiritual experiments, largely destroyed from within by discord before the final conquest.
So Gnosticism, born and thriving in this crucible, was ultimately overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed by the conflicts, seen as a threat by both pagans and Orthodox Christians. Its attempts to bridge East and West, philosophy and mysticism, were perhaps brilliant but ultimately premature for the times.
Which brings us to our final section. Global spiritual convergence, East-West parallels, and meditational paths. Thinking about those connections beyond Alexandria.
Yes, looking at the bigger picture. Those caravan routes we mentioned earlier, linking China, India, Persia, Syria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, they were absolutely crucial from the Christian era onwards.
More than just trade routes.
Far more. They were arteries of communication. They facilitated tremendous migrations of people, often escaping social, political, or religious persecution. And this movement led to an unprecedented mingling of philosophical, scientific, political, and religious beliefs,
creating a much wider perspective.
A wider world of religious insight than had likely existed before on such a scale. While merchants focused on business, these routes provided relative safety for intellectuals, mystics, scholars traveling between centers of learning academies in Greece, libraries in Alexandria, perhaps even universities like Nalanda in India.
Nalanda?
A huge Buddhist monastic university in India. flourishing around this time with perhaps 25,000 students, observatories, laboratories, knowledge of its existence, and its sophisticated philosophies likely diffused westward along these routes.
And this exchange had a profound effect.
It led to the rise of what we now call comparative religion. People started recognizing common symbols, shared astrological systems, similar calendars, even related myths and deities across different cultures. Schools sprang up in Ephesus, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, Athens, specifically focused on studying and trying to unite these diverse beliefs.
And it challenged literalism.
Critically, this cross-cultural exchange attacked purely literal interpretations of sacred writings. It became increasingly clear that many ancient scriptures were symbolic, allegorical, with deep and real meanings, best discovered through comparative study. Hall uses St. John's Book of Revelation as a prime example, almost unintelligible literally, but full of meaning when decoded symbolically.
And two groups really embraced this comparative symbolic approach.
The Gnostics and the Neoplatonists stood out. Both groups came to realize, through different paths perhaps, that beneath the surface diversity of religious traditions lay one essential story, one core mystical truth.
Max Miller's idea.
Never was there a false religion, unless a child is a false man, meaning every tradition contains some aspect of the truth appropriate for its time and people.
Where did this impulse come from, this turn inwards?
Hall suggests this mystical flame often arises from within humanity during times of crisis, when political, cultural, social, religious structures are collapsing, when priesthoods become corrupt or lose their spiritual vitality.
People seek answers elsewhere.
Or rather, within. The repentance, piety, urgency, and desperation of disillusioned individuals leads them away from failed external authorities towards a direct personal search for the divine will, often found through philosophical exploration of nature and, crucially, through inner disciplines.
Like meditation. Were Eastern systems known?
Oh yes. Oriental meditational systems like yoga were certainly available in the Mediterranean world at this time. They influenced Pythagoras much earlier and clearly influenced Neoplatonism.
And the Gnostics.
Gnosticism was particularly open about possessing a secret discipline for the release of man's internal content, a methodology to help individuals become directly aware of their true nature and their place in the divine plan.
Salvation had to be earned.
Yes. Gnostics generally believed salvation wasn't just granted, it had to be earned through effort, understanding, and transformation. The individual had to make a science out of his own redemption.
And the source of Scripture itself.
They saw the real source of authentic scriptural revelation not as external dictation, but as mystical experience, the internal, direct experiences of enlightened beings throughout history.
Which obviously challenged organized religion.
Tremendously. If the ultimate truth is found inward, through direct experience, then external religious forms, temples, rituals, scriptures, clergy become secondary. They become gateways, perhaps, preparatory structures, but not the source itself.
Temples, mosques, synagogues,
Gates toward a mystical experience, as Hall puts it, not the experience itself. Even the Christian Mass, viewed as a mystery drama, provides a powerful sense of inner depth, but unlocking its deepest meaning requires individual decision, capacity, and inner work.
The goal being
the realization of the universal temple, where nature, God, and the awakened human unite, recognizing that mysterious bond between the individual soul and the infinite pattern. The only actual eternal fulfillment comes when the individual parts the veil and experiences the infinite directly.
Gnosticism had strong ties to Egypt.
Very strong. Hall even suggests Gnosticism might provide the only clue we now have to the inner meaning of Egyptian faith, since the keys to fully understanding the hieroglyphic mysteries seem to be lost.
What was the core principle derived from Egypt?
This profound idea, everything visible is simply the long shadow of an invisible principle. Everything that is a letter of the law is merely the reflection of the spirit of the law.
The letter killeth.
But the spirit giveth life.
Exactly.
Forms, if clung to literally, can kill consciousness by limiting exploration to the surface. This need for revitalization, for penetrating the form to reach the spirit, fueled these mystical movements.
And several related systems emerged or flourished alongside Gnosticism.
Yes, Hall mentions key threads. Astrology, derived largely from Chaldea and Babylon, perpetuated by Gnostics. Hermetic philosophy and alchemy, named after Hermes, contemporary with Gnosticism, think of the divine Pymander, and Kabbalism, the Jewish mystical tradition, given strong impetus around this time by figures like Rabbi Akiba and Simeon ben Jokai.
All trying to get beneath the surface.
All aiming to break through the symbolic surface of religion, to discover the living spiritual content within, to transform faith from mere belief into a vital life force for individual redemption, the full unfolding of that divine potential so man can become, as they might put it, a God like the Father who created him.
How did Jesus fit into this transformation?
In these Gnostic and Kabbalistic systems, the figure of Jesus often underwent a metamorphosis. He shifted from being primarily a historical person to becoming a symbol of a universal divine power of intercession.
The messianic offering as a bridge.
Yes, a bridge enabling the potential for union between the human soul and the Father, the ultimate Godhead. St. Paul, who Hall suggests was likely an initiate of the mysteries, perhaps at Ephesus, really picked up this concept.
Transforming the Redeemer.
Transforming the historical Redeemer into the embodiment or vehicle of God's redeeming power itself. The Soter, the divine savior principle, used the human Jesus as a living bridge.
And texts like the Pistis Sophia reflect this.
Absolutely. The Pistis Sophia, though its dating is debated, Hall suggests 3rd century or earlier based on content, preserves purported esoteric instructions given by Jesus to Mary Magdalene and the apostles after the resurrection. It fundamentally transforms the New Testament narrative into a mystical testimony of human regeneration.
It sounds like these groups were trying to unify beliefs.
There was a desperate effort by these minority groups, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, Hermeticists, to unlock the universal mystery of salvation, to reinterpret diverse theologies in a way that showed they all pointed to the same core truths, proving all faiths were essentially right, despite different names and allegories.
But the outcome was?
Paradoxically, instead of unity, it often fueled a great cycle of religious dissension. Each established group resisted having its faith interpreted by others, or accepting other faiths as equally true.
Leading to entrenchment.
Leading people to cling tighter and tighter to orthodoxy, partly to protect oneself from the works of the devil, as they saw these alternative interpretations, which, as we know, led to the persecution of Gnostics practically out of existence by the 3rd century.
Their art destroyed.
Leaving mainly those engraved stones, saved only for their material value. A similar fate, though less total destruction, befell the Manichaean movement, that great eastern branch of Gnostic Christianity which, despite persecution and excommunication, moved eastward, mingling with and modifying Brahmanism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism across Asia.
But the symbols themselves remain powerful pathways.
They do. Think about common Christian symbols: a cross, the fish. Gnostic gems show these alongside Egyptian deities, Greek inscriptions, words later found in Kabbalah and ceremonial magic. Even medieval grimoires, the Keys of Solomon, likely have roots in Gnostic systems.
Mandalas too?
Gnostic mandalas often represented the universe itself, sometimes as 2 interpenetrating circles or overlapping cycles. Very powerful contemplative tools.
Let's take the cross. Its meaning goes beyond the crucifixion.
Far beyond. That's a relatively late, specifically Christian application. Universally, the cross is a Pythagorean symbol of equilibrium, balance. It symbolizes matter, the 4 elements, the human body where the soul is crucified. It represents the 4 directions of space, the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. It's literally the sign of addition.
Vertical and horizontal lines.
The vertical representing descending life, spirit, the horizontal representing receptive, sometimes deceptive matter, where positive and negative meet.
And the Egyptian Ankh.
The crux ansata, the cross with a loop instead of the upper bar, a very ancient symbol, often signifying life, or water, the element of life, baptism, righteousness, forgiveness. It was even used on Nilometers to measure the Nile's life-giving flood. Pharaohs were depicted forgiving enemies, with an ankh emerging from their mouth thousands of years BC.
The ship is another universal symbol.
The ship of salvation, yes, seen everywhere. Peter the fisherman's ring, the ark, the very nave of a church, from nautis, ship. It carries souls across the dangerous sea of life and death to the blessed land. Priests, bodhisattvas, Buddhas are often the crew. Water itself, the Jordan, the river Styx, even the Milky Way often symbolizes that mysterious boundary.
And contemplating these unlocks meaning.
The idea is that any individual with sufficient insight can contemplate these universal symbols and discover their meaning internally. It's about research inward. Gnostic anology, the ladder of ascent, wasn't just theoretical. It represented stages experienced through internal meditation.
The Abraxas symbol representing the human.
Representing the powers within the human frauda. The rooster head as the heart or the inner sun. The whole figure using Pythagorean numerology to portray the structure of the mystery of himself.
So the path is always inward.
Always inward. It's not competitive. Someone seeking truth within their own soul isn't really in conflict with any external religion, Hall argues. It's a deeply, devoutly religious pursuit that can theoretically be undertaken within any faith tradition.
Becoming your own priest.
Your own physician, the priest before the altar of his own soul, achieving direct inward communication with the Father. The true purpose of mystery rituals was precisely to awaken this inner potential.
Even dreams play a role.
Dreams are seen as symbolic pictures arising from the subconscious, embodying attitudes and archetypal forms that can be interpreted. And the great dream is the dream of life itself, which each person interprets according to their own level of development.
Heaven, too, is internal.
The dream of heaven, that universal aspiration, is seen as a spiritual dream of man, founded on an archetypal reality within. The kingdom of heaven is within you. It's discovered by that journey inward through the spheres, the eons, a journey described allegorically by poets like Dante or Milton. The constant focus is the internal approach to the meaning of symbols.
So take the cross again.
Transform it from just an external object into a psychological study of your own inner resources, your own potential for balance and integration. Combine that with the Christian crucifixion mystery, and it unfolds into a cosmic mystery, providing insight into universal faith.
This explains the variations in symbols, different crosses, rituals.
Why the ark looks different from the Latin cross or the Eastern cross. Why rituals and regalia differ. They all point back, Hall argues, to a great universal purpose. When that sense is lost, the symbols become superficial, their meanings debated endlessly on the surface.
Which leads to the modern predicament.
Exactly. You see clergy today questioning trite orthodoxies, feeling their faiths lack deeper meaning. Hall suggests if they truly knew the inner substance of these symbols, the esoteric keys, they wouldn't feel the need to leave their traditions. They could revitalize them from within.
Where did this inner knowledge survive?
Largely through discrete mystical orders, often operating secretly, perpetuating oral traditions alongside the fragmented written record. These threads fueled modern mysticism.
And the motivation is peace.
Ultimately, yes. The search for truth is motivated by the deep human impulse that applied truth, understood truth, leads eventually to universal peace, happiness, security.
Which requires discretion. Harpocrates again.
Harpocrates, the god of discretion, finger to his lips. Sacred things should not be profaned or cast before swine. Discretion protects not only from persecution, but also from confusing those not ready. Knowing when to speak, when to be silent, it represents the individual's absolute right to their inner life.
Enter a sacred place. Be discreet.
About what you learn here. The meditational discipline itself becomes your temple. Your prayer rug the magic carpet for that inward journey.
The universe as symbol, man as interpreter.
The universe is the great mandala. Places of worship are symbols of the universe. And man himself is the ultimate symbol of the cathedral, of the universe capable of interpreting everything, opening the gates, solving the riddle of the Sphinx, because he potentially contains all knowledge within.
He is the mystery.
He is the magician, the sage, the saint, the scholar. He is that old teacher archetypal symbol, the personification of mysteries, Gnostic, Neoplatonist, Platonist, Pythagorean, Christian saint, pagan savior, all point to that archetypal wisdom reachable by internal meditation, instructing through those inner experiences which are irrefutable, the mystical illumination.
Wow. We've certainly journeyed through an intricate and, as you said, often misunderstood world today. Gnosticism, from its rediscovery to its really profound insights.
We've seen how it offered this radical understanding of creation, of deity, of human purpose, and how that search for liberating knowledge, Gnosis, wasn't really about escaping sin in the usual sense.
But about awakening to our true, potentially divine nature.
Exactly. The Gnostics, often trapped between these warring theological factions, were trying to reconcile beliefs, find that common esoteric core. Hall calls it the science of salvation that transcends the external forms.
Which leaves us with a provocative thought, perhaps. What if, as these sources suggest, the real answers to our deepest questions, the path to maybe even universal peace and understanding, isn't ultimately found in external doctrines or political structures or societal fixes,
but in that disciplined internal quest, that search for the divine spark within ourselves?
How might our world actually change if we, individually and collectively, prioritize that inner work? If we, too, aim to become knowing ones in this ancient tradition of profound insight?
It's a powerful question to ponder.
It certainly is. That's our deep dive for today. Keep pondering, keep exploring.